want to shift gears a little bit and go on to the topic of mental toughness. It's a word that's thrown around these days a lot. So in your opinion, what is mental toughness and how do you actually improve it?
I think in general, I've always thought people perceive mental toughness as this like gritting through pain or gritting through, something, or it has a very like macho connotation to it. But what I've found in coaching athletes is that the ones that are the most mentally tough actually are the most mindful or aware or have the best understanding of how their mind works, and they use positivity tools. So here you have this. It's like you have this person, this image of mental toughness. It's like the gritty macho guy, but it's the person who remains positive in negative situations. The one who's like sunshine and rainbows, who actually is more resilient than the macho tough guy who just grinds themselves into the floor. Mm-hmm. And so having observed this, and literally in the sport of CrossFit, it grinds people to a pulp. Right? I mean, it's just a function of this sport that it really is a constant slog. And I've always found that the athletes that can find positivity, that have a more, the ability to turn their lemons into lemonade, are the ones that are resilient in the sport. And contrast that to what most people think. They're like, man, I just need to go tough this out. And it's like, that's not, or they fail something and they get pissed about it. And it's like that anger is actually something that I think is holding you back from improving, rather than looking at it and like, man, I failed. Now I know what I need to work on next. Having a more objective perspective is the thing that builds mental toughness, not grit or like dogged macho perseverance.
Is that a quality that can develop and then that applies to a broad spectrum of different competencies, even if you haven't been exposed to that particular task before? Or is there an element of specificity where you need to have been exposed to that specific maybe stimuli or event or task in the past to be able to, know what it's going to feel like and then prepare for it as a consequence of that? Or can you just, do the work prior to, and then no matter what is thrown at you, you're going to, go at it, let's say with peace, with ease, and with a lot more composure than someone else might?
Well, I like to use, so you said with peace and ease, and I like to think of it more like the Stoics would have, with equanimity, right? So they look at it and they're like, this is what it is. This is what I'm doing, the same event as everyone else. No one else has ever seen this odd thing that has come out before, this strange combination of events. No one else is more prepared for this specific situation than I am. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go do my best. Like, there's no reason to complain about it's raining for the snatch event. There's no reason to complain about the weather, because everyone's got to deal with the same weather, and you don't have control over that. You only have control over what you're focusing on, over what you're going to attack. And I think if you can get people to build the habit of focusing on their locus of control over the things that they can influence, I always think those athletes are going to perform better over the long run than athletes who are constantly belly aching about things that are outside of their control. And I say belly aching, but even just like constantly thinking about the things that are outside of their control. It just leads to this neurotic, like constant, flow of thought pattern that I think, keeps them in this more stressed state all the time. So they're not recovering as well between events. They're not thinking about what their next step is, or, the new event is released. And rather than thinking of like going into the panic of, I've never seen these things before, instead say, okay, this is what I'm up against. Now, how do I attack part A, part B, and part C of this new challenge that's in front of me?
And I can imagine that this is not just something that you think one day and then you just apply that to everything that you do. It has to be, you have to work on it. So how do you guys at Training Think Tank kind of bake that into the cake of that training environment, that high performance environment, so that all your athletes can benefit from that competency, from that mindset, and from that approach to events, to workouts, et cetera, et cetera?
For sure. I think one of the first steps to that is really an education side, is that teaching people that mental toughness is something different than what they probably think it is. And some of that comes down to recommending that people read The Obstacle is the Way, Ryan Holiday's book, which I think is a fantastic introduction to stoic philosophy. Talking to people after setbacks and failures and helping them put those things into context, encouraging people to adopt the habit of changing their lemons into lemonade. Like, you failed this. That's fine. Now we know what you need to work on. Whereas before you failed this thing, like, we had no idea. We didn't know what we were up against. Now we know how to attack it. I think some of that comes in conversation, but then the other aspect is integrating it into the training environment. And I think some of that comes from creating competition prep scenarios where, 3-4 weeks out from the games, we brought Noah in this past year for a games prep camp. We brought a handful of other really talented athletes in to come train with him. And the events were all unknown every single day. It was the same structure, same format. They knew nothing about what they were going to be attacking, but it was in a controlled environment. It was in an environment where the stakes were low, so that it was a good opportunity for Noah and the other athletes that were there, obviously, to practice dealing with some of the psychological tactics that can show up at the CrossFit Games. And this year was, man, they introduced that. I don't know how much attention you paid to the CrossFit Games, but adding that, they ran 5-6K
the turnaround,
and then they got in and they thought they were done. And that was like, the terrain on that was nasty.
It was, yeah.
And they're like, all right, we're done. They sprint to the finish. And then literally they're like, no, now you have to run the entire thing in reverse, turn around and go back. Like, whoa. You better have that, the mental game turned up to level 10 if you want to be able to deal with something like that.
Yeah, that mindset, maybe that's almost that stoic approach, if you want to call it like that, to competition. Is that something that you maybe saw early on from one of the top competitors at the time that kind of startled you a little bit because you maybe hadn't thought about it this way before, or just they were just thinking on a completely different level than the average person?
I think I honestly can't remember a time that I didn't think that way. Like, I think back to when I was in high school and competing and like really starting to take it seriously. And I just always had this focus on things that were in my control. And I think I'm going to be forthright. My dad was is a psychology professor. And I think that there was definitely some influence there where it was like, encouraging me to shift thinking and to change the way that I approached problems and developing problem-solving skills. And so I will tell you, as an athlete, I always just assumed that's how everyone thought. And then when I started coaching, I realized that it's a very rare skill to be able to think that way, to be able to turn negatives into positives, that wasn't just a normal skill that people developed growing up, which I've now had to learn and now teaching to my children. But I realized how much in teaching it to my children, in school and sport, I realized how much of an advantage that little psychological skill has developed over the course of a lifetime. And then, I recognize that some of the other athletes that I trained with and that I coached and competed with, some of them had that same ability to take something and it's like, man, I'm not good at this aspect of my sport, so I'm going to go attack this aspect of my sport. And I'm going to go get better at this piece. And the ones that did kept rising. And the ones that didn't eventually stagnated and fell off. And I just always found that to be a very interesting thing. And then at some point, this was years ago now, but I read Ryan Holiday's book, and it was like, I was like, oh man, this is how I've always thought. Obstacles away. I was like, this is how I've always thought. And this is how all the best athletes that I've met think. What is this? And then I realized that, in there, he introduced it as stoic philosophy. And I was like, oh, I'm going to start digging into this. And since then I've been recommending that athletes read obstacles away as an introduction and then start digging into more, complex stoic philosophy and try and adopt that way of thinking in their training, because I think it does make people absolutely more resilient. I think it allows them to achieve at a higher level over the long run. It's not something that's going to just make you better tomorrow. You can't just say, you can't look at a problem and be like, I'm going to get better at my handstand push-ups, and then tomorrow you're better at your handstand push-ups. It literally has to be something that's like ingrained in your way of training and your training environment and the way that you think and the way that you live your life for it to have that kind of influence for you.
Maybe going on a little tangent here, but if you don't mind sharing, how are you imparting this to your children? How are you trying to teach your children to have that approach to life?
Well, the big one, so my oldest daughter is in 3rd grade and she's been doing digital learning. So it's been different this year because obviously she's at home learning. And one of the things that I've been trying to teach her is that, she would get stressed about how much stuff she had left to do for the day. And I would remind her that that by focusing on how much she has to do, she's not actually getting anything done, that she needs to focus on the next task and complete that task and then move on to the next task rather than thinking of the big picture. And I think that is kind of masked stoic philosophy, right? Where it's like solve one problem at a time. The big thing is eventually you need to tackle this mountain of work. But the first thing you have to do is you have to walk up to the mountain, to the bottom of the mountain. And then you have to solve this first scramble puzzle, and then you have to go around this, like you can't jump up to the top of the mountain. Like you're never going to look up there and be able to solve that problem. So that's a big piece. Then the other one, actually, when I was just competing at, most recently, it was like the first time that my kids had really been there while I was competing in an event. And I kept reminding my oldest daughter, I was like, you can't win focusing on winning. You win events by focusing on how you execute. Because she would ask me right before I'd go out, she'd go, Dad, are you going to win this event? And I was like, it's not what I'm focused on. And I did go out and win the event, but I didn't do it by focusing on winning the event. I did it by focusing on how I was going to execute, on my plan, my execution, and, staying in my lane, to borrow an old swim term. And I just kept reminding her of that. And now, if I asked her, I'm like, what do you have to do today? Well, I'm going to focus on my first task or my first project. I just have my ELI. And I was like, okay, great. You're learning, you're getting it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
That first task strategy reminds me of a story I heard from Bud's training with the Navy SEALs, where the most successful ones were always focused on maybe the next meal, which was every 6 hours at some points, or the next sunrise or the next sunset, where other people that thought too far ahead, I'm going to get through those 6 months of grueling training, they didn't make it as often as the people that had a shorter kind of outlook on what they had to accomplish. And just like you said, task at hand, accomplish this, then look at the next one, kind of one step at a time, one step after the other.
I think to that point as well, there's actually been some research that they did on Marine recruits and using mindfulness meditation. And they found that they just split, it's the Marines. So they just split them into 2 groups. One group did mindfulness and the other group didn't. And the group that practiced mindfulness meditation were far more resilient. There we go. There's mental toughness. There's toughness and resilience showing up as a psychological skill again. And essentially what they were teaching those Marine recruits to do is to focus on the moment, focus on the task at hand, be present. And by doing that, like, injury risk goes down because you're less likely to make a mistake. Instead of thinking about, oh man, we still have like 10 weeks left in basic training. Like, I don't think I can make it through. You're like, I'm going to focus on making it to my next meal. Or I'm going to focus on what I'm doing right now so I can get this right. It's a simple, it's so, when you start doing it, it becomes so, it seems so odd that other people aren't focused that way, that so many people are projecting so far into the future. And it's like, well, that's what's keeping you from getting done what you need to get done.